Welcome to Inside Analog Photo. I'm your host, Scott Shepard. The Inside Analog Photo radio program is all about the traditional photographic process. We talk about all aspects of analog photography, including the hybrid workflow. You can find out more information over at www.insideanalogphoto.com. And of course, Inside Analog Photo is brought to you by Fujifilm, making life more colorful. These guys have the coolest instant photography materials known to mankind. They have, of course, the pack film in 3¼ by 4¼ and 4x5, color and black and white. They have the Instax systems in the wide format, the Instax 210 camera and film, and of course the Instax Mini in the Instax Mini 7 and the Instax Mini 25, both in color film. Beautiful stuff. There's nothing cooler than instant photography. You get a print, because if you don't have a print, you don't have a real photograph. This is great fun stuff. This is great for art. This is great for business. This is cool stuff. You definitely want to check them out over at www.fujifilmusa.com/professional, making life more colorful. Our friends over at Photo Publicist, providing worldwide publicity, strategic promotion, social media marketing, and business development for the photographer, turning photographers into celebrities. You can find out more information over at www.photopublicist.com. Our friends at Richard Photo Lab, for the highest quality work known to mankind anywhere on this planet. Unbelievable developing, scanning, and of course, output on high quality Fuji Crystal Archive. Unbelievable cool stuff these guys are up to. And remember, you don't have a photograph unless you have a print in your hand, and you need to print your pictures. This is important. You need to supply proofs to your customers and even print your own work, because it's not about looking at it on a monitor. It's about holding a print in your hand. Definitely check these guys out at Richard Photo Lab, of course, at richardphotolab.com. Our friends over at DR5 Chrome Black and White, developing that turns your black and white neg into, that's right, black and white chrome. Unbelievable stuff. www.dr5.com. Our friends over at Upstrap upstrap-pro.com for the camera strap that will not slip off your shoulder, guaranteed bar none, the coolest strap around. Our friends at Iger Studios, for the finest quality drum scans known to mankind, igerstudios.com. Our official media partner, APUG, the Analog Photography User Group, for all things traditional photographic process on the web, www.apug.org. And our official philanthropic partner, George Eastman House, International Museum of Photography and Film, over at www.eastmanhouse.org. Today on Inside Analog Photo, we're going to be here with Scully Osterman and Mark Osterman from Scully and Osterman Studio in Rochester, New York. These people are the leaders when it comes to original historic processes. You can check out their website over at www.collodion.org. And we're going to talk today about a very cool program that they just did. This is the first time they've worked together in their 19 years. They did a series called Twilight of Photography, and these are sun sketches. This is unbelievable work. This is actually fabulous, over the top, true, original, analog photography at its purest form. So, of course, France and Mark are going to join us today to talk about this very cool project they did. France is an unbelievable photographer. She does one-on workshops at their studio in Rochester. And, of course, Mark is involved very heavily with the George Eastman House, doing historic processes, archivalists, teaching these historic processes, and now they actually have very cool workshops, and Mark's got one coming up here very soon with our buddy Ron Mowry about silver gelatin emulsion making. So, these guys are really into it. If you want to talk about pure analog, these guys are on it. This is really cool stuff. France, Mark, how are you guys doing today?
Fine, Scott. How are you doing?
We're doing great. Thanks for joining us here on Inside Analog Photography to talk about yourselves, your beautiful photography, and even more so, this very unique project that you guys have just done in the UK called The Light at Laycock. Great stuff you're doing here.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Before we get into this here, why don't you guys give us the elevator pitch on what you guys are doing? I know you have your studio. You guys are doing unique individual bodies of work separately, but why don't each of you tell me about yourself so people can know if they're not familiar with your work?
Well, I've been working at George Eastman House now for 10 years. Although France and I originally came up in 1995 to teach collodion workshops at George Eastman House. My job in the last 10 years has been to teach photo conservators the technical evolution of photography by doing primary research with the collection And then I would demonstrate and then get them to make images using all of the 19th century processes. And that included everything from asphalt heliographs that Niepce made up to making gelatin emulsions. That program ended last year, and we knew it was going to end. It was no surprise. It was generously funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Now, for the museum, I'm doing what I originally came to the museum to do with France more than 10 years ago, to teach public workshops in obscure, I would say, arcane photographic processes. We never actually use the word alternative. We use historic processes.
Now, is this part of the museum charter as they want to educate the public in the history and conservatory aspects of photography?
Yeah, actually, it's good that you point that out. It is part of the charter. Well, first of all, the Conservation Lab at Eastman House was the first photographic conservation lab in the world. And most of the well-known photoconservators have passed through Eastman House at one point in their education. So I'm still embedded with the Conservation Department because I still serve the Conservation Department. Much of my job is showing the difference between a poorly made 19th century image that's in good condition as opposed to a well-made 19th century image in poor condition. That can scramble your head thinking that maybe it looks the same, but they don't look the same. And it makes a big difference to someone who's a collector or a dealer or a curator. And so it's more like a course in connoisseurship. So now that the general program has ended, now I'm doing another part of the charter, and that is, yes, teaching people what photography was. I'm not a digital photographer, and there's only so much you can cram in your head. But most of my job is telling people, to the best of my ability, how something was done or the different ways the same thing could be done. And that's a concept that's lost on people that do historic processes today.
Do you find, Mark, that the people that come to these workshops and things you're doing at Eastman House are very familiar with all aspects of photography and they're looking just to expand? Or is this something that people are looking to do an art that has more of a tactile hands-on craft than just pushing a shutter and playing in the computer?
What's funny is that now that we're open up to the public and not teaching just photoconservators, is that we have a really wide range of people. We have photo historians, we have college students, we have artists, we have commercial photographers. Everybody's kind of coming for a different reason. And actually, it's that mix of people during a workshop that makes it a very great learning experience, because everybody's kind of looking over their shoulder, but for a different reason.
France, tell us about yourself.
Well, we have a skylight studio here in our house in Rochester, New York. It's a Northlight authentic style photographic studio. So while Mark is teaching at Eastman House, I'm teaching here. And of course, we use our studio for our own work as well. But I teach artists who come for private classes, and then I have occasional workshops here as well. So I tend to teach the artists while Mark has been teaching conservators.
Now that's changed.
Right. Now you guys are teaching everybody.
France is my biggest competitor.
Well, at least part of the money is going to the same place, hopefully.
That's true.
It's all good.
France, tell me about the private tutorials and the work you're doing. Are you doing wet plate collodion, tintype? What type of work are you doing and you're teaching there at the studio?
I teach primarily wet plate collodion, but I also teach dry plate collodion on occasion. And of course, we're going to be teaching that this summer together. But yeah, I teach wet plate collodion, dry plate collodion, also albumin printing, salt printing, photogenic drawing, and some other historic processes. But primarily it's collodion, which is negatives and positives. And the positives are either on glass, which are amber types, or on metal plates, which are called tin types. So a variety of historic processes.
Do you find that these historic processes are safe and sane to practice? Is this a danger when it comes to the chemicals and these cyanides and all these things that people aren't typically used to dealing with these days?
People like to make a big deal about that, about how dangerous they are. I think they're only dangerous if you don't have respect for the chemicals and if you're a little bit careless. I think if you keep in mind what you're dealing with and know what to do and what not to do, I think that it can be fairly safe. So that's one of the things that we teach, and Mark and I are both pretty careful ourselves, and we try to set that precedent for the people that we're teaching. What it is you mix together and what you don't, and how you store things, and I think just some basic common sense is important. But I think it's safe. I mean, I think there's some chemicals I might not have around if I had little children in the house, but we don't have that. So I might lock them up more carefully if I had that situation. But I think if you're sensible and have some common sense and take some precautions, I think they can be very safe. We've been doing it for 20 years, and so far, so good.
You guys still have your fingers and all your fingernails, and everything's good.
That's right.
Yeah.
Although I didn't realize I had so much common sense, but I'm going to believe France.
There you go.
That we do.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk about this very unique workshop and body of work that you guys did in the UK called the Dawn of Photography. You guys had taught about this unique process, but then spent a week yourself doing this just fabulous, beautiful work.
What happened is sometime last year, or maybe the year before, we had given a workshop in London. France, what was the studio where we did that workshop?
It was at Minnie Weiss's studio.
That's right. Minnie Weiss is a photographer in the UK. She's the sister of Rachel Weisz, the actress. She had us come over and do a workshop at her studio. And while we were there, a couple of very interesting things happened. One of them was we met up with an old friend of ours, Roger Watson, who's an American, who's now the director of the Fox Talbot Museum in Wiltshire, Laycock. We tossed around the idea of doing a workshop at Laycock Abbey, and he wanted us to come over and do collodion. And we said, no, not collodion. We want to do a Talbot process. And then we found out that this year would have been the 175th anniversary of William Henry Fox Talbot making the first negative for making positive prints, so paper negative. We thought, well, we've got to do that. And France and I have been making photogenic drawings for years. It's not that difficult a process. And it seemed like a nice fit for Laycock Abbey. Roger had just refurbished a barn to make a darkroom. So we set it up as a joint venture between Scully and Osterman, our studio name, George Eastman House as an institution, and the William Henry Fox Talbot Museum. So it was kind of a three-tiered effort. And it filled up very quickly.
We had 10 students, and this was a perfect timing for this workshop because photogenic drawing negatives were Talbot's first negative-positive process. So it was just perfect timing for the anniversary, and what a great way to celebrate.
We had 10 people, but where were they from? They were from all over the place.
Yeah, we had several Americans. We had somebody from Germany, somebody from Sweden, I think, and several Brits, and a few others. I'm trying to remember where they're from, but it was a great group.
We were going to make botanicals, which are the easiest thing to do. But what really made the workshop magical is that these people could actually pick from the same plants that Talbot was picking from and print these things at the same location where Talbot print. It was goose-bumping magical there. And then also, we thought, well, wouldn't it be fun for everybody to have a camera? So I looked over the cameras we have at Eastman House and other cameras that Roger was able to send me pictures of. I designed a Talbot-style photogenic drawing camera out of wood and brass. I made the prototype and sent it over to England. Roger found a man over there to make the wood parts, and then I made the brass-barreled lenses for it. So everybody at the workshop got a Talbot-style camera to keep when they went home. They went home with these great cameras, and they made images in them. And the images were just breathtaking.
So let's talk about this whole process of making the cameras itself. What did you use for lenses? Is this something that somebody can construct? Does Mark have a kit now that we can buy to make our own camera, like the Osterman Heath camera kit?
Well, I mean, it's really very easy. You have to look at the technology of the era. In fact, I have to tell you, before I did photography, and in fact my degree in art school was actually musical instrument making. I made many, many musical instruments inlaid with mother of pearl, and so these things are just boxes. Now, in my little workshop in the garage, I have a table saw, a bandsaw, and a sander. But I don't have a planer, so I have to hand plane things. My stock for wood is when I drive around on trash night and people throw out dresser drawers. The sides of dresser drawers are almost always the same thickness. It's well-seasoned wood, and occasionally you find some decent wood like mahogany or walnut. Poplar's fine for something like this. The lenses on these cameras were built the way Talbot would have. There's a brass barrel, and the stock that I used was hand railing stock. So I would cut that with a large pipe cutter. I then cut 2 thin rings out of the same material and then cut a slot in each one of those rings so that they could be compressed and pushed into the brass tubing to secure either side of the lens. The typical lenses of that era were your simple biconvex or plano-convex magnifying lenses, and that sort of thing you can find online.
So you just brought a bunch of glass magnifying lenses.
That's it. You just glass magnifying lenses of the right diameter. This was actually kind of hard because lens manufacturers measure the diameter of their lens in one system. The people that sell brass tubing measure their outside diameter in another system, and they do the inside diameter with another system. So I had to buy, I think, 3 vernier calipers to keep it straight because it would have been a nightmare otherwise. But once I got the system down, I cranked through the lenses pretty quickly and sent them over to England. But it was very, very easy. The thing that makes the Talbot camera very different, at least the photogenic drawing camera, is that the process is incredibly slow, and the cameras themselves don't have a separate plate holder. You actually just open up a door in the back, you put the paper in, and you put the door over the paper. So to focus the camera, Talbot's cameras had holes drilled in the front plate, covered with a cork or a little swivel piece of brass. So when you're out there taking the pictures, you actually remove the cork, look into the camera, and you see the projected image on the sensitive paper. And while you're looking at that image, you focus the lens, and then you compose and put the cork back in, and then just let it sit.
So I guess maybe we should get into the treatment of the paper itself, because this has, some kind of silver nitrate on it and some salt?
We coat the paper with a salt solution and then let it dry, and then we coat it with a silver nitrate solution, and then that has to dry. As soon as it's coated with the silver nitrate and dried, then you want to use that right away. So we would fit them into the little cameras, and then we would set them out. So it's not a complicated process, but there's a lot of handcrafting in your own paper, which is a really wonderful experience.
France did all the coating for our papers. I loaded them. I did the easy part. But didn't you use a Blanchard brush for that, France?
I did, and a Blanchard brush is made, and the way we made them is to take a piece of glass about maybe an inch wide by 3 inches long maybe, and then we would wrap a little bit of cotton around the end with a piece of flannel and then tie it around with a string. So I would dip the Blanchard brush into the solution and then sort of brush it across the paper and sort of keep brushing until we have no puddles or streaks. So you sort of get the hang of it. It's not rocket science.
That brush is a really great system because you can make them any width you want. If you're doing alternative or historic processes, you use a piece of glass that's a little thicker than window glass if you can, and you can cut them an inch and a half, 2 inches, 3 inches. Then you're putting just cotton wadding around one end, and then a larger piece of cotton flannel to cover that up, and then tie it with a string. When you're done, you throw that part away, the cloth, and you wash the glass, and you can renew the brush again. It's a very cheap way of making brushes, and very authentic to Talbot's time.
And it's great because we could use the same brush for the same solution throughout most of the day. And if it gets contaminated, you throw that part away and make another one. So it's really wonderful. And of course, sensitizing the paper is that part of the process that's very painterly. And then of course, the final image is very painterly. So it sort of ties it all together. Once we have the paper coated, we would fit it into the cameras. And then we like to say, as a trapper sets a trap line, we walk around to the Abbey and set the cameras all over the place, in trees and tie them on defense posts. We put them into little nooks and crannies. And after the first day, we realized, hey, there's 8 or 9 cameras out there, and we're going to start forgetting where they are. We started making a little map of where we were placing them so we could keep track.
It was a little bit like worrying about finding Easter eggs 5 months later.
When you're coating this paper and doing this process, I guess how people would relate this to the ISO is maybe like, 1?
Oh, no, it's way, way slower than that.
So you can do this in daylight, or is this something that needs to be done in the dark?
Well, you can do it with a couple of 60, 70-watt bulbs in the same room, and we're using a hairdryer to dry both the salt and the silver. But silver chloride is not all that sensitive as long as you're not near an open window or outside. So we could coat these things pretty easily in a room that was pretty well lit. And like I say, we could look into the camera and see the visual image inside, or the virtual image inside. This is the same process in the beginning as salt printing. So when you're doing a salt print and you lay a negative in contact with this paper in the bright sun, it might take 10, 15 minutes or longer to print. But in a camera, it takes much longer. So I can't even calculate the ISO. These are lensed cameras. I don't remember working out the speed of those lenses, but when we did architecture in bright sun, we needed at least 2 hours. Architecture is going to be the easiest thing to photograph.
If it was cloudy, which is typical of England, more overcast, more raining, it was more like 5 or 6 hours of exposure. Our longest exposure was 2 days, and that was for an exposure where we had the camera sitting inside on a mantle at the bed and breakfast where we were staying, the rectory, and it was pointing towards a window, and we wanted to capture the breakfast table and then the light coming in from the window. So that was a 2-day exposure.
Did we come back with maybe 55 or so images?
57, something like that, yeah.
It was a lot of work.
I think one thing is unique is where you shot this stuff at is extremely historic in England, and I think for people that are into motion pictures, isn't this one of the places where they filmed Harry Potter?
The village of Laycock itself, I think the oldest house there is probably from the 12th century or so. And all they have to do is a production company just needs to come in and put earth on the pavement, and they can film any period piece there. But the Abbey itself, yes, I mean, it was amazing to see a tourist walk up to take a picture of a rose bush in front of the door where the ladder picture was taken by Talbot. The very famous picture with the ladder in the upper floor and the person up in the upper door. And these people have no idea of the importance of that particular spot or that this iconic picture had been made there. But that was typical. There were anywhere from 600 to 1,200 people walking around the Abbey a day when we were there. And as long as we put the cameras up high enough so that the dozens and dozens of toddlers didn't pick them up, we were able to make an image.
You know what is so cool about this process on top of it is you have these very historic landmarked buildings and these architectural shots that you have with no people around. Because it's so slow that people can walk by, and I guess it doesn't bother the exposure.
Yes, because it would have to be hours in order to pick up something. I mean, if it's a 2-hour exposure, I think they'd have to be there for an hour or so to show up, wouldn't you think, Mark?
I would say they'd have to be at least half the time to show up, so 3 hours. France pointed one out that we think may be a docent, so somebody that's helping the tourist who would go to the same place and sit down in between times when they were helping. I think it's a baby carriage, but I don't know.
I think it's a ghost.
There are thousands of ghosts there.
I bet there is, probably.
When we shot the images, our intention was never to actually repeat his own images. Now, we did an obligatory image of the Oriole window because you're at Lake Hawk, you have to make a picture of the Oriole window. But most of our approach was just to see what would work. And then as the light became more dim, as we had worse weather toward the end of the shoot, we realized that what we should be shooting then was not so much the object or the subject, but the light around. So instead of the light shining on the subject, we started photographing the light that surrounds the subject or objects. And that started to give us some things that we didn't expect.
Yeah, there's a few images that we shot where we would put the camera in a rabbit hole so that the camera was actually pointing up into the trees. So when you walked by, you couldn't see the camera at all. It was completely down into this hole. And the image that we got from it is almost like a blue sphere. You could see the trees, like you're looking up at the trees, and there's a little bit of movement. But you can also see the grass at the bottom of the image. And so it creates this sort of round sphere. So it's photographing the space. You're documenting the trees, of course, but now it suddenly becomes this celestial sphere and looks almost like you're looking at the moon. So it sort of plays tricks with you. It was just a wonderful treasure, wonderful surprise.
We had 3 different size cameras that we were running. There was the prototype that I had made that all of the people at the previous week had been using, that style. And then I made 6 smaller cameras. Then we had one that I had made back, I think, in 2000 that made an image that was about the size of a 35 millimeter format, which was very much like Talbot's, what his wife called mousetrap cameras. And each one gave a slightly different look. The medium-sized cameras clipped the image, so they often had a circular fall-off and created a tondo format. And the larger camera, I think, led all the way to the edges, and the smaller one was just completely different than the rest. What we found while we were there, though, which is interesting, is that our intention was originally to never show these original negatives, the actual pieces that we made in the cameras, because the process that Talbot invented, the photogenic drawing process, doesn't actually fix these images. He used the term fix, but he was actually placing them into solutions of either sodium chloride or potassium bromide or potassium iodide. And what these various chemicals do is to make the unexposed parts just less sensitive. It doesn't actually remove them the way we think of fixing today. In fact, when Talbot actually got to using sodium thiosulfate, or hypo, he and Herschel used the term wash out rather than fix. So the idea of washing out, which actually makes more sense than fixing, to wash out the unexposed silver to make the image permanent. We knew that we would come back with these essentially stabilized negatives, which if you re-expose them to light, the highlights turn different colors. So they'll turn a primrose yellow, a light yellow, or they'll turn a lilac color, or they'll turn a French blue in the highlights. And then the darker areas of the images would go from brown to shades of red. This is when photography was colorful before everything went brown, but it's not stable. And so we knew we couldn't show these actual pieces that we had made in the cameras. The intention was, and the concept was, to scan them, enlarge them, and print them out as large pigment prints as negatives. And we like that idea, that the digital process, which is making the negative obsolete, makes it possible for people for the very first time to see what a photogenic drawing looked like. France, why don't you talk about the discovery of inverting them and what we found there, because I think that's interesting.
And one question I have real quick, too, is when you have these prints, and say you store them in a book and there's no light getting to them, can you open them and look at them and then close them back up and it's something you can look at for a brief time and they sort of are somewhat stable, or they're affected immediately?
If we look at them at low light situation or at night, they're not going to be so affected. But if you're looking at them in daylight or in sunlight, yes. I mean, sitting there looking at them for a long period of time, they'll change. So you want to sort of keep them under wraps whenever possible. You're not going to display them, for example. That will continually change them. So what we did was we scanned them, and we wanted to see what they looked like as positive, just sort of out of curiosity. And when we did that, we realized that we were getting a lot more information than we would get if we printed through them and made a positive print that way. We were getting much more information. Because when you make a positive print from one of these negatives, what happens is you capture that fiber in the paper from the negative. That's actually going to cause noise so that you don't get as much information in the print. But when you scan it as a negative and then invert it that way, you get a lot more information. So we were just floored by all the information we were getting from this. The first test shot I did was of the village of Laycock, and I took it from the viewpoint of our hotel room window. I just left it in the window all day long. I think it was like 5 hours or something. It was a rainy day. And we took that little, I think it's 1 by 2 inch or something like that, negative, and we scanned it, and then we inverted it. And you could actually see that it had been raining. You could actually see that the streets were wet. I mean, it was just mind-blowing how much you got. And yet it's this beautiful softness from the paper that you can see the paper fibers. So it's sort of yin-yang of surprising information and this little tiny negative, and it's the softness from the paper and beautiful colors. So what's not to like? It was really wonderful to find that out. So we thought, well, we really have to show these as positives. We show some of the negatives as well, but for the most part, we decided to go with showing the positives. And so we're taking a process from the dawn of photography and also using digital, which is from the twilight of photography, and we're sort of combining those two, bridging those two gaps. We really like that idea as well.
I guess you could say, is digital the death of photography?
Well, you have to define your own definition for photography.
I mean, really, if you look at it, there's a lot of people that say that digital is not photography, it's imaging.
Well, even these prints that we're making now, understand that the exhibition prints that we made for this body of work, what are they, France? 40-something by 50-something. And we don't consider those photographs. They are ink. Just like if you were to reproduce a photograph in a book, you wouldn't say that that image is a photograph if it's a reproduction of a photograph. Or in the 1920s, if you had a gravure from a photograph, you would have called it a gravure. So the photography we did was at Laycock. The final imaging that we're making on these large pigment prints here in Rochester, we don't consider photographic. We consider that printing. And we're okay with that. I mean, there are no rules when you're making art.
No.
And we weren't looking for a historical thread completely. The entire concept was about combining these two media. What's also interesting is if you were to make a print the way Talbot did with these negatives, and that is shining light through the paper negative onto a new piece of sensitive paper, it actually destroys the negative while you're making the positive. And there's something great about that concept too, but that wasn't part of what we were looking for. And when we inverted them digitally to make them into a positive, as France said, not only did we get much more visual information that Talbot would have loved, it's not something he would have hated, he would have loved it. But even though we didn't get the fibers of the paper by transmitted light shining through the paper, we got the most amazing trompe-l'oeil resolution of the actual fibers from the surface of the paper because we were scanning them. And what we found, we did a trial exhibition in Binghamton, New York at Anthony Brunelli Gallery. When the people came to the opening, yes, we had like almost 900 people at that opening. They were looking at the print, maybe 5 feet away, and then they'd go up to the print, and they'd put their head against the wall so that they could see across the paper because they weren't sure if the texture they were seeing was actually part of the physical paper or whether it was something that was printed on the paper. It was a little bit like when cats watch birds on television and they go around the back of the television to find out where they are.
Right.
It was great.
And I think it's so great that you can take such a historic, original analog process and show it to the world using a digital form because, I mean, like you said, otherwise, what are they going to do? Go in the vault at Eastman House and the guy's going to flip the lights off and you could look at it for 20 seconds and it's gone?
Well, I'll tell you that if you were to find a museum that had photogenic drawing, you'd have to be real special before they pull those things out and show them to you with a 15-watt bulb. There are many of them in museums that are in very, very good condition, but they're like night albums, things that you show in the evening by candlelight. They're not the sort of thing that they'd ever display. So it's a very different kind of an object. When Talbot eventually came to discover the next version of his paper negative process, the calotype, and that's the process that most people think of when they think of Talbot, that process was 100 times more sensitive than this process. And of course, he couldn't use those same cameras with the holes in the front, and everything changed. They were permanent, they were fixed, and then he made salt prints from them, which were also fixed. So this is a very, very special, strange, but unbelievably colorful process that we were doing, the photogenic drawing process.
These things are beautiful. Let's give people information right now so they can go look at these prints because, like you said, they're colorful. They're not brown.
I wish you could see the real things.
I'm sure the real things probably look better than the scans that are on your website.
Well, yeah, they're a different character, but you know how that is.
Sure, exactly. It's like looking at a piece of chrome.
Yeah.
So your website where they can find this is at collodion.org?
That's correct. And on our gallery page. Also, Mark is on Facebook, so Mark Osterman, and he has an album called The Light at Laycock Exhibit, so that shows the images as well. That's also a nice way to look at them.
I'm new to Facebook. I don't know what the hell I'm doing with it. I'm never quite sure when I'm putting a comment on my wall or personally, so you have to bear with me. I'm really good at the old processes, but I'm struggling with 21st century technology.
I think that the whole social media Facebook thing is sort of cool and good in one point, but then another way I find it to be just complete time wasting. It's like hanging out online on forums.
Well, I have to tell you that we used to go on a forum years ago, maybe one or two forums, and we stopped going on the forums because we would put in our 2 cents and it would be based on real experiences. We found a lot of people that would basically say, if you don't do it my way, it isn't the right way. And of course, I base all of our research on, I'm very lucky. I work at Eastman House, and if your listeners have never been to Eastman House, it's mecca for photography. I can read an article or a manuscript in the rare book room. I can look at the actual equipment in the technology area. I can then look at a print or negative in the print archives. I can make them in my darkroom, and then I can compare the original and mine in the conservation lab under a microscope. I mean, if you can't make something with that kind of equipment behind you, you're not going to make anything. So I'm very lucky.
You are. Eastman House is a fabulous place.
It is an unbelievable place. And if you want to help us out, become a member, because it is a private museum. It's not owned by Kodak like a lot of people think. And actually, now that we're teaching these public workshops, if you're interested in these old processes, we don't just teach a process. We teach a process and a concept. Whenever we teach a process, we will give people a lecture on the history and the chemistry, and then we'll actually go down and look at vintage, amazing images made with the processes that people are learning during that workshop. And it's an opportunity that just shouldn't be missed. We'll do the Laycock thing again this summer. It was so popular. And in fact, the museum said, look, once you're over there, you should probably do another workshop. So back to back, we're teaching a photogenic drawing workshop. Again, everybody will get the camera. And then we'll be doing not only a wet plate collodion photography, but a dry plate collodion negative process in that same workshop.
So let's talk about what you guys are doing with your personal workshops and stuff that are going. So people that want to attend things that you guys are doing personally, how do they find out about that? Because your work is fabulous, and I think that really there's nowhere you can learn this stuff except what you guys are teaching. This is a very unique opportunity for people that want to learn about these historic processes.
Well, Francis, we just did a workshop in Texas. When was that? Like a month ago?
Yes. In November, we did a workshop at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin. That was a workshop that was on photogenic drawings, but we also included chromotypes by Robert Hunt and some other more obscure processes, and that was a great workshop. We have some other workshops coming up. I know Mark has a whole slew of them at Eastman House, and I'll be teaching some more this year, but I haven't really put my schedule together. But I listed on our website, collodion.org, under workshops, so people can check that out when they get a chance.
Don't take her workshop, take my workshop.
Here's my question of the day. You guys have been together for like 18, 19 years. You're both fabulous photographers in your own right. Why was this the first project that you guys worked on as a collaborative mission?
Gee, France, you want to answer that?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's because up until now, we've been sort of working on our own projects. We have lots of ideas and not really enough time. I think that's part of the thing. It's so hard as an artist to find time to do your own work when you're making a living. And I have to say, I know very few artists who solely make their living as artists. I have to tell you right off the bat. And I think when I give talks at art schools and universities around the country, I think a lot of students are surprised to hear that. I'm not sure why they don't know that. But you always have to have another hat. So our other hat is, for both of us, is teaching. So we tend to do a lot of that and less of our own work, unfortunately.
France, on the other hand, it's interesting that both of us make our livings teaching historic processes. I think that's probably unique as well. And I joke around us being competitors, but there are many other processes that I teach that I haven't brought home. I'll do research in a process, and if I think it's something that we can actually use at home, I'll bring it home, I'll tell France about it, we'll work on it. And if she thinks it's something that we can actually use that will translate for some body of work, she's the one that actually puts in all the hours of perfecting that process. But not every process we think is a great process for the art. There are many of them that are interesting and are difficult and are esoteric, but it has to contribute to the imagery. When you look at our work in our exhibitions, we never have an exhibition that says photogenic drawings by Scully and Osterman or ambrotypes France Scully Osterman or salt prints. We never mention the process. We mention the title of the show, which is based on the subject of the body of work. When we're artists, we don't really want to talk about process. That's when the process teacher hat comes off, and we want to talk about the imagery. Talking about the process is like somebody saying, I love your frames. And the process should be a seamless fit that contributes to it. Maybe somebody will say, what the hell am I looking at? And say, well, that's an ambrotype. And they'll say, well, why did you use that? And if you don't have a good answer, I don't know, maybe you need to step back a little bit and find out what's the fit for your imagery.
Yeah, I like to say that Adobe picture of a van is Adobe picture of a van. I don't care if it's a daguerreotype or what it is. If the process sort of overtakes it, if that's what you think is going to be sort of a magic bullet to get you into fame by using some esoteric process, well, I think you might be disappointed because I think the process really should just be a support for the imagery. You don't usually ask an artist what kind of paints they use. That's really not usually that important. It's the image, the final product that's really important, and I think it should be all about the idea behind the image. The process really should be a support for that. So we've been doing photogenic drawings, both of us, for quite some time, but hadn't yet found any reason to do it as artists. We've been teaching it.
Like albumin printing. France is my biggest competitor on teaching albumin workshops, but France does custom albumin printing for other people, and yet we have never made an albumin print and put it on exhibition. We just don't like them because they're shiny, even though we're really good at making them.
Yeah, and I have a little problem with the fact that they yellow over time, but it's just a personal thing.
But there are many processes like that. The asphalt process, the albumin on glass negative process that preceded collodion, it actually has the highest resolution of any photographic process. But the exposure times are incredibly long, and you have to develop them for at least an hour before you even see an image. We did a workshop at Niepce's house where the very first photograph was taken in Saint-Lô-de-Varennes, France. And we had some people come to that workshop, but I don't know why. Maybe just for the experience of doing something so strange. But not every process we see as something that's particularly useful, but it might be interesting from a historic point of view.
I think, too, that photographers are always interested in the gear, the film, the emulsion, the process. Yeah. And I think people, they shouldn't care about how you made it. Maybe photographers want to know, and they're always like, well, what'd you shoot it with? What gear? What this camera? What emulsion? And I think it's a great point that you get to, that it's about the print. It's about the image. Who cares how you made it?
I guess you're right. I mean, people interested in the technology of it will ask the questions, but you want to walk away from those questions in an opening, say. If you give a talk, sometimes people ask questions like that, and we understand it. And the other thing about it is the trappings of things made by hand. So when people make platinum prints or cyanotype prints, and they do a lot of brush work on the edges, we understand the need to do that. People really want to show they made things with their hands. And collodion in particular, and this is for another talk, but collodion in particular can be very sloppy, and sometimes that can really contribute to a picture, and sometimes maybe not so much. But we leave ourselves open for that. For us, we work very cleanly in a lot of these processes and sometimes have to loosen up a little bit just to make them less out of the box. This body of work at Laycock was just so much fun, and I can see us doing it actually in other places now that we made the images that we did. that I think I'm going to go back and look over some of the other processes we overlooked in the last 10, 15 years. But you mentioned the workshops. This year, for the 2011 season of these workshops at Eastman House, and we only started them the last half of last year, we're teaching, let me think now. Well, we have Ron Mowry, who I think you've had on your program already. I just had lunch with him today. He's one of my retired Kodak buddies. They come to Eastman House about once a month, and we have lunches together, and I'm the dumb kid at the table. These guys are brilliant. They've forgotten more things than I'll ever learn. Ron is teaching an emulsion workshop in January. We only have a few spaces left for that. The next workshop is actually daguerreotype with Mike Robinson, who's the modern master of daguerreotyping. I'll be teaching carbon, how to make your own tissues and print. I'll be teaching Niepce's asphalt process sometime in the summer. I'm teaching pre-photography processes. So Physionotrace, camera lucida, drawing techniques, and a host of other. I mean, if they go to the website at Eastman House, the actual website for workshops is too long for me to remember. But I think there's a link on our website, and Eastman House, if you go to activities, I think it'll take you there.
Yeah, there's a link on our website as well.
Last year, we taught a workshop that we titled 1839. What it was every participant made a daguerreotype the way Daguerre made them. Not the way people are making them today, but the way Daguerre made them. They made a photogenic drawing, like Talbot did, all the different variants. And they made, by ours, direct positive process, the picture of the self-portrait of the drowned man. And none of these processes had ever been taught to the general public singly or individually. Here at this workshop titled 1839, you could see every photographic process that was being done in 1839 and compare them for the first time. It was really a lot of fun.
Definitely sounds like very cool opportunities and almost makes you want to go hang out in Rochester for a few months.
Well, sure. And the funny thing is that people don't realize that museums have things for people to see, that most of the things are not on display on the wall. And so if you ask, you can come and see them. We have many researchers come to George Eastman House, spend a day, 2 days, a week, 2 weeks, if somebody's writing a book in the library. The research library at Eastman House has every book ever written on most photographic techniques plus monographs. Books all the way back to Isaac Newton and Johannes Zahn, just amazing things. Even books with tipped-in pictures by Julia Margaret Cameron. We have 2 copies of The Pencil of Nature there, and Sun Pictures of Scotland, which is Talbot's other book. Manuscript collections, it's amazing. It's a resource that your listeners should take advantage of.
They should. So I really appreciate it, France, Mark, to join us today. This is just unbelievable work that you guys did, this whole dawn of photography and what you did at the Fox Talbot Museum, and this whole body of work is incredible. And I think that people should really look at your website. These are on display at the Eastman House?
No, we're not on the wall at Eastman House. I work there, so you display them in other places than where you work. What's funny is we went into this project not knowing what we would have, and so we only scheduled one exhibition because we didn't think we'd come back with anything. And now for the next year and a half, we're going to be placing the show in other venues. So they'll have to look on our website to see when we have that on display. And we also do have a little booklet, which is essentially a small catalog that you can buy on our website. It shows some of the images, the actual size of those images. But it's the light at Laycock at the sun sketches at the twilight of photography.
Thanks, guys, for joining me today. I look forward to having you both back on the program to talk about your individual works and more stuff. Mark, about the class coming up with you and Ron Mowry, and there's just so much stuff going on. Lots of stuff to talk about, but I really appreciate you joining me today talking about this process and what you did and this whole body of work, and it's fabulous, beautiful stuff.
Thanks for having us, Scott.
Thank you very much.
Well, there you go. France and Mark Osterman. You can check out their website over at www.collodion.org. We'll have a link to it on InsideAnalogPhoto.com. And of course, the fabulous workshops that Mark are doing is on eastmanhouse.org. And what France is doing is at collodion.org. So this is a really cool opportunity for you to look at what they're doing, look at the images that they've exhibited, look at this work they did with the Twilight of Photography series. This is pretty beautiful stuff, and this is real. This is 100% pure analog. So I think you should look at this work. We're going to have more information coming up about France and Mark, different programs to talk about each one of their works individually. There's a lot of stuff to go over, and we just look forward to having these guys back on the program. They're unbelievable photographers. They're really helping keeping the analog process alive, the historic processes. This is fabulous work. The Inside Analog Photo radio program has been brought to you by Fujifilm for their full line of instant cameras and film, and of course, fine quality Fuji Crystal Archive paper over at www.fujifilmusa.com/professional. Our friends at Photo Publicist, worldwide publicity, strategic promotion, social media marketing, and business development over at www.photopublicist.com. Our friends at Richard Photo Lab for the finest quality lab in the country, richardphotolab.com. Our friends over at DR5 for black and white chrome at dr5.com. Upstrap for the finest quality camera strap that will not slide off your shoulder at upstrap-pro.com. Our friends over at Iger Studios at igerstudios.com. And of course, our media partners of the Analog Photography User Group at apug.org, and our official philanthropic partner, George Eastman House, over at eastmanhouse.org. I've been your host, Scott Shippert, here on Inside Analog Photo. We'll be back next week with more great analog photography.